everybody. Today we have Grant Hanson from Texas in the United States, and he is president of the Acquisition Pipeline Systems. Now, I personally love that name. And what they do is an end-to-end fractional CMO solution specifically designed for private equity firms executing roll-up strategies, which is right up my alley. So welcome, Grant. Thank you for your time and coming along today.
Greg, thank you so much for having me, my friend. I appreciate it very much.
Well, we've chatted before, and
Yeah.
you are just an onion that just has so many different layers to it, so many different stories behind it. You have worked on smaller companies, larger companies, and now you are heavily involved with some very strategic partners in roll-ups. So tell me a bit about what you've done in the roll-up space, please, and how this fractional CMO stuff works in roll-ups, because that excites me.
Well, so I got started in the space sort of on accident, to be frank with you. I've spent most of my time in business development, spent a lot of time in the addiction treatment, mental health space, all that kind of stuff. And was kind of getting out of that space, and I just started, submitting resumes, interviewing with people, seeing kind of where my next direction would be. Landed with a company that was starting to basically execute a long-term roll-up in like a vertical integration play in the senior care space. So the silver tsunami, the boomers are retiring at a rate of 10,000 plus per day. And so the home health senior care space was definitely, according to all the data, a really good space to be in. So we've had a very well put together board. And so, yeah, we were vertically integrating everything from home health to senior care facilities to physician-led practices, et cetera, et cetera. And it turned out to be just a really great learning experience for me because it was kind of my first exposure to the mergers and acquisition space. And I quickly fell in love with it. I got to take all the things that I had learned in sales and business development, lead generation, marketing, et cetera, and sort of convert it into, to put it simply, I saw it as the same sort of activities, except for instead of selling a product, we're trying to buy your company. Other than that, the systems and conversations were the same, at least the way I saw it, And so I started to figure out that was a huge gap in the space, in the mergers and acquisition space, especially again in the roll-up space, because you're talking about, firms and companies who are trying to acquire in volume. They're not just strategic acquirers here and there. They're trying to acquire several companies a month.
And doing bolt-ons as well of synergy.
Exactly. So, I think I quickly figured out that long-term goal is like, okay, I really want to be in this space long-term. I have a skill set I can bring to the table, right? The other side, the side that you're very, very well versed in, the integration side, sort of post-LOI, post-acquisition, that side of things was the side I didn't know so well. Right. So I saw it as kind of an earn while I learn play for me long term, right? Is I could bring my skills to the table in lead generation, building out all the systems needed to bring, right, proprietary deal flow at scale for these companies so that we could execute buyer-led deals versus banker-led deals, right? So that we could cut out the middleman and have direct conversations, and again, in volume. And that allowed me to do that, be successful at that, but also learn from the guys on the other side of the equation and start to see how things worked post-acquisition with integration, how it looked like to analyze financials, look at P&Ls, all that kind of stuff, which I was still kind of getting new at and getting used to.
And when do you think that learning was going to stop, by the way?
Never.
I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and I said, this is how I started, and this is how I used to do things. And then over the years, my implementation strategies, the way that I do things, has changed so much. I was very much a process-oriented type person, and now I've gone far more towards the people side of person. Yeah. That's how I implement things now, from a people perspective rather than from a fit process and systems.
Yeah. What caused you to make that change?
Well, you were talking about senior care. I'll talk about aged care. And I was doing an aged care implementation, and I walked in and they said, well, we are totally people oriented. in this organization. Everything will be done with people focused primarily. And I'm thinking at the back of my head that, yeah, right, that's never going to work. But that was I accepted the role and I walked in, so I had to play the game. And yes, it did work. And I understood how it worked. And you're constantly coming across new experience. You made an off-the-cuff comment before, pay to learn before. Now, that might seem a little flippant when you hear that. Isn't it the truth in every role, every business that you take on? Because you're not going to be the expert in that business. Every business that you acquire is different and is constructed of different people. It's not a flippant comment. What you said there was totally correct.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I see it the exact same way. I know that I have a skill set, and considering my long-term goals in private equity and getting involved, I have, again, bigger plays that I'm looking at down the road for what I want to do in the space.
Do you want to share?
Yeah, so second chance hiring. Yeah, second chance hiring initiatives are a big passion of mine for people with criminal backgrounds and people who have had adverse backgrounds that prevent them from being able to enter certain areas of the workforce because, not all of us are entrepreneurial, right? Not everybody with a criminal background can just be an entrepreneur. That's just not realistic. A lot of people can, but not everybody can. And so it's a big passion of mine. And so what I hope to do long term in the space is, learn along the way while I'm doing this for different private equity firms and individuals that I'm working with, learn enough about what I don't know, right? Because eventually I'll have to outsource some of that anyways, right? I'm not going to be an expert at everything, and nobody's supposed to be. But eventually what I like to do is once I start a fund of some kind and I start to acquire, there will be some obviously roll-up activity that happens there, but eventually I'd like to get into a place where, I can acquire a group of companies and then begin by leading by example, if you will, right? Where I can start to staff the companies that I acquire, whether in whole or in part, with individuals with various criminal backgrounds, et cetera. And then, again, take those initiatives and be an example to the marketplace that, hey, just because these individuals have these backgrounds doesn't mean that not only can they do a job, but oftentimes can be some of the best individuals that you could possibly consider for these jobs because they're very grateful. I have a background that puts me in this place where I'm again, it's part of the reason I'm passionate about it. I worked in the recovery space for a long time as a result, so I had a startup idea that I was working on a few years back, a platform to this end. I realized how difficult it was going to be because it takes a lot of convincing other individuals, other people, companies to kind of buy into your vision. Not everybody does. So I saw this as sort of an alternative route to accomplishing the same thing, right? If I can just be the acquirer and be in control of the staffing that happens, and then that's another avenue for me to then take that data and then hopefully at that point I can get something much larger going after that, so that's sort of a passion project for me and kind of a big long-term goal. It's a few years down the road for sure, but definitely something I hope to accomplish.
I never know where these conversations are going to go. That was not where I thought it would go. However, I have a billionaire that I'm going to give you an introduction to.
Okay.
Who I think has a similar objective. So
I love that.
I think that I will be giving you an introduction to someone that will be able to help you with that. And that's why these conversations are so important. Right. It is about helping one another and about finding out who the person is that you're talking to. And that's one of the reasons why I find these podcasts so interesting. And before I do a podcast, I always go and review previous podcasts of that person to make sure that I'm not asking the same questions others have asked.
Sure.
Still, I did not expect that response. Thank you very much for sharing, Grant.
Thank you for asking. I appreciate you giving me the platform to share that. I don't get to talk about that as often now. So I'm excited for the day that that becomes a reality. Certainly.
Well, it is not something that I ever would have thought of. It's not something that would have come into my realm at all. And yeah, but fortunately, I deal with a variety of different people and may be able to connect you with someone that will be able to help. So that's great. Okay,
Very
let's,
grateful. Thank
most welcome. Let's move on then. So tell me about a roll up or where it's been a struggle. And why has it been a struggle for you?
Well, the first one. Well, the past couple have
Okay.
been. We spoke a little bit about this. You know, it was a great. The silver lining were the relationships that came out of it, for sure. Some individuals on the board, very high level in their spaces. Chief development officer, very high level corporate development, M&A, chief of M&A at a lot of different large corporations here in America. So there's some good relationships that came out of it. However, it's just these difficult ones have taught me the hard questions to ask up front that I just didn't know. You just don't know when you're first getting into the space. You don't know how to vet the opportunity correctly. And one of the things I didn't ask enough questions about was the funding. Was do we have funding? Do we actually have the funding to execute these acquisitions? You know, do we have the banking relationships? Do we have investor funds raised, et cetera? Right. I'll just say it like this. It was completely misrepresented by one of the individuals who was leading the organization, what the funding sufficiency actually was, what relationships we did or didn't have in that area. And within about a 90-day period, you know, we're talking about companies that are in the middle to lower middle market, you know, range. So I'd say anything under less than about 20 million in revenue. And so I built a pipeline, and it wasn't just a pipeline of leads. These were actually actionable businesses with motivated sellers, good financials. I'm leaving out all the rest with a combined enterprise value of probably between 250 to 300 million dollars, right? Combined. That was a 90-day period, maybe 4 months or so, just give or take, you know. And that's again partly what showed me, hey, I can do this. I can make this happen in this space. Like but deals were not getting done regardless. And so that's when we started to ask questions. And at the time, obviously, everybody's ability to get paid was based on these deals getting done, you know, and deals just didn't get done. We finally started to ask questions, kept getting kind of, you know, taking down these little different rabbit trails, and finally just figured out that it wasn't there. It wasn't there, you
Mm.
know. Um, there were individuals on the board who were not aware, you know, and so again, it was just a huge learning experience. We finally had to call these individuals out on what was going on. Everybody sort of just left right off the bat. You know, once it was figured out, because I had a team I was running too. That was the hard part. Was I'm trying to be a buffer between them and the leadership, you
Yes.
know, and I felt like I was lying to my team. Like I just felt like I wasn't being honest, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like I can't just my conscience won't allow me. So I finally just told them. I said, this is what's going on. They were dependent on the income too, you know. So yeah, it was just a hard learning experience, an expensive learning experience. It put me in a rough spot there, but then I learned, okay, now I have to be much more direct going forward when I'm, especially companies that are new, right, and just getting started in a space. I have to make sure that I see proof of funds, that I see, hey, if we bring deals to the table that are ready to execute, I need to know that you have the funding sufficiency to actually get the deals done. Otherwise, I'm wasting my time and energy. That was a really tough one, you know, but again, a good lesson learned. But it was painful. It was painful.
Absolutely. So was that out of inexperience or was that just criminal behavior?
Well, I filed a
Oh,
lawsuit. So yeah, no, I think both. I think both. I'll say this. I'll say I think it was more out of inexperience than I think out of just pure ill intent. I think that the intention was to actually do this, but like home health
mm,
agencies especially are almost strictly cash flow businesses. Very, very few of them have any hard assets. Now, where you get into the facilities, that's a little different, but these are cash flow businesses, and this is at a time when, with no track record, no deals having already been done yet, as a company at least, right? The terms that we were going, and I wasn't part of the banking conversations, but the terms, the hope was that they would put a collection of these deals together, go to the banks
Yeah.
and secure loan terms that were just completely unreasonable, especially without having a track record or having any hard assets, strictly cash flow, et cetera. Over 300 meetings, I'm told, is what were had, and every single one of them resulted in the exact same answer. Like, no, go get some deals done, then we can talk about
Wow.
these terms. They were offering SBA, blah, blah, blah. And they just wouldn't accept it. They were like, no, we can get these terms somewhere. Nobody would say yes. Nobody. I do think it was kind of a pie in the sky, maybe a pipe dream. Like we think if we just talk to enough people, we can get somebody to give us these terms. And it just didn't happen, and an absolute refusal to actually just raise private like investor funds from like H&Is or family offices. There was an just refusal to even go that route. Don't know why. Couldn't explain the reasoning behind that. So as a result, we just kind of hit a dead end, and we all said, "Okay, bye bye."
I guess it comes from experience, really, doesn't it? But I've been doing this for a couple of decades or so now, and right now I'm in the middle of doing a dental roll-up here in Australia, dental
I know.
practice roll-up. And why, you may say, why dental? Obviously, the numbers all work out pretty well, but that wasn't the reason. The reason is I went to my funder and I said, what are you prepared to fund? So that I can solve that problem that you're talking about there.
The
Get
other way
that
around.
sorted out first up.
Yeah.
What are you prepared to fund? And they said, well, dental's good money. It all works out pretty well there. We'll give you money for dental. Okay, tick. So
Done.
I then went off to the PEs and I said, hey, what are you looking for? Dental, maybe? They said, yes, we're looking for dental. So I put the funding and then the buyer in place before I started anything. Well, it's just experience.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. You learn from your own mistakes, but I just learned from your mistake as well. And that's what I'm hoping the people watching this podcast are doing as well. They're learning from your mistake, they're learning from mine and others so that they don't make these mistakes and they become more profitable, more successful.
Absolutely.
But one of the things that you said there was on the funding side, and it sparked another thought because I literally just jumped out of a meeting before this one, and it was on finances and integration. And when the accountant was doing the analysis of the finances, I noticed that they did not account for the integration costs, which is where 80 odd % of business of roll-ups and M&As fail because of the integration. And it's not because of the bad integration or the poor integration. It's because it wasn't accounted for previously to a suitable degree.
That's right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was another experience I had. So I witnessed it firsthand.
Right, okay. So when you're doing, if you don't mind, can we just continue that conversation a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely.
You see, what people do with integration is, and please butt in, they create a list of tasks and they create a list of departments that have to do those tasks. But what they don't do is allocate the person to that task. How much does that person get paid to that task? How long is that task going to take?
Right.
And then that final comment, the total, that's the part that's scary. How much is all of that line item going to cost me? And then after I complete all of those line items, bottom right corner, what is that total?
Absolutely.
That's how much it's going to cost me to integrate this. And then I've had this come every single time. I've had the finance manager come to me and say, can we reduce that? Can we tweak this? Can we do something here? Sure, you can. But that will introduce more risk. That will introduce more timeframes. That's going to introduce the overall cost more.
Why would you do that? I don't understand why you wouldn't be as conservative as possible in a scenario like that. I think there's a people element too, like you talked about a minute ago. There's the cultural element, and not, again, when I was moved in kind of the home services space, not taking into account what was going to happen when we were buying these owners out completely, and being these types of businesses, pest control, roofing, plumbing, electrical, whatever, those types of businesses are blue collar owners, a lot of times legacy businesses, family owned businesses, right? They're community businesses. And, that was a huge
Sometimes
piece
they've
of it.
got the wife working in the office and the husband's out in the field.
Yeah,
So you've got the entire family unit there.
absolutely, absolutely. And whenever your goal is to get the owner out of the way as soon as possible, that can backfire quickly, and that's exactly what we saw happen. There was lots of salespeople and technicians, never mind trying to fold everybody into the same softwares and HR systems and all that kind of stuff, but just like the people aspect of it and the relational aspect of it, and not accounting for that, and just the attrition that happens when you don't take into account how integral, whether they're integral to the day-to-day operations or not, that's one thing. But it's a whole other thing when you realize just how integral they are, just to not just the employee relationships, but the customer relationships, relationships with referral sources, maybe relationships with vendors for purchasing materials, etc., whatever that looks like. And we just saw a major decline in the organic value of the companies decline, after the acquisition happened, because all of those things started to kind of fall apart. Technicians would leave, referral sources would leave, et cetera, right? And those are things that we're just not taking into account, because I think there was just too much. Whoops, sorry, my phone's talking to me there. Just not taking that stuff into account hurt us dramatically, because they were very acquisition focused and not, they didn't plan ahead of time for the integration side of things. They were like, let's just acquire, and then we'll figure out integration. Well, it seemed like a good problem to have at first, but they had to pause all acquisition activity indefinitely, because things were
Yeah.
just starting to only grow to the point of constraint, right? And there was lots of things starting to break.
If you haven't got your core working perfectly, you automated, systemized, documented, and then you haven't got that integration process documented and automated as well, you can't grow. You have to expand, finish, expand, finish, expand, finish. You can't, well, there's a good deal, take that on. There's another one, take that on. You just can't do it. You have to have your core perfect. Otherwise, you're not in a position to grow rapidly anyway.
Absolutely. I could not agree more.
I've seen that. I've been involved with that. And again, that's why I developed a training program for C-suite, because C-suite have vision, but most often C-suite have only done 1, 2 acquisitions in their time. Therefore, they don't have the experience of, okay, it's not just about getting the signature on the paper. It's about the integration. It's about attaining the profits, attaining that vision over the next couple of years that you originally had for that business acquisition. And they don't have the experience because they don't know what to account for. As I said, I just popped out of this meeting to do this podcast with you, and they had this checklist of integration. And I looked at it. It was 343 steps. Now, okay, that's good for the afternoon, but now can we get serious? Each one, each one of those departments should have an identical list to that of at least 300 steps that need to take place. And if you haven't got that list ready, you haven't got that time frame ready, you haven't got that resource allocated, I'm sorry, I've got my crystal ball out here of 25 years of experience. I can say my crystal ball says you're going to fail. Sorry. And it's regrettable that these people are going into meetings and going into these projects and they're just not equipped. But the good news is that's why we're here.
Absolutely. But it compounds when you're talking about a roll, like you said, when you're talking about a roll up, it compounds that even more, because you're trying to integrate several companies a month, potentially, if you can get up to that. But like you said, people get so focused on the acquisition part of things that they don't, like you said, roll a few up, tighten up the integration process through those few acquisitions, you roll up a few more, tighten up the process where you, again, like you said, have something that's systematized, automated, repeatable. And yeah, I've seen where that can go horribly wrong, and
now, I would have said systematized myself, but I'm not even sure if that's a real word. but I would have said the same thing.
Have I been saying a fake word this whole time?
I've got no clue, but that's the word I would have used.
Well, we can trademark it if it's not.
But yes, if you do one properly and efficiently, so I built a system for an organization a couple of years ago now, and their biggest problem was onboarding staff. It used up so many resources. They had so many connectivities into the payroll, into the credit card system, into the security system, and all that sort of stuff. Not to mention the file system and storage, and all of that sort of stuff. But they couldn't do it efficiently. It took so much resources. It took them 3 weeks to bring on 12 printers, 12 remote printers efficiently so that, yeah, I know, but that proved the point. They couldn't do it. So I came from an IT background years ago. So I sat down one weekend and I wrote out a 55 process system so that I could bring on an entire site, all their users, migrate them across in 5 minutes.
Wow.
I could build the site, bring all the users across, create it all in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Now that's an environment that is systematized.
Yeah.
Trademark. Well, Grant, this I thoroughly believe has been very useful for everybody that's going to watch this and learn from this. It's not the successes that you get the most learnings from. It's the failures. You've got to identify where the failures were, and not in a mean way or a finger pointing way, but who the failures came from, so that you can then do the upskilling, put in better systems and systemize them better. Can't use systemize. Yeah. So yes, you need to have all that in place. Otherwise, you're just adding more risk and more chance of failure to things.
Absolutely.
Can you give us a couple of minutes roundup, please?
Sure.
1, on what we've done today. 2, on you and who should come and talk to you and why, please?
Yeah. So, I think, a big theme for today was, not just learning from our own mistakes, but like you said, learning from the failures that have occurred, that we've gotten to witness, that have contributed to things not working out with different individuals that we've worked with, different places that we've been, and getting kind of to see the silver lining, in that. And very, very grateful because my my kind of launch into the space, regardless of those other opportunities not necessarily working out, has propelled me into the space because of the introductions that have continued to come as a ripple effect of just my own skill set and what I've been able to do in the space. So being able to see it for what it was and take the good things, learn from the bad, so it's very, very valuable in that sense. And I didn't think it would work any other way, entering a new space. But, now you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the call, kind of what it looks like to be a fractional CMO. And the reason the reason I started phrasing it that way and calling it that was because, again, I'm doing the entire origination side of things now, since I've tacked on sourcing capital as well as handling a lot of the marketing, and just the organic growth of these businesses once they've been acquired from the inside. So the customer acquisition as well. And so, but handling everything on the origination side, it still boils down to marketing activities. And again, when you're trying to build out systems that can generate this proprietary deal flow of motivated sellers of different types of companies, it's really not much different, if different at all, from the same types of systems, both outbound and inbound, that you would put in place for customer acquisition. Again, you're just changing the conversation from I'm selling you a product to I want to buy your company, basically. That's a little overly simplistic, but you get what I mean, And so especially when you're in these middle to the lower middle market companies, and there's tons of, these are very fragmented spaces, tons of companies out there. So it felt like everything that I was doing boiled down to it's a fractional CMO type role, right? Because it's all marketing. It all boils down to marketing and everything that falls underneath that. And so, again, building out everything from cold outreach, boiling that down to reaching out to as many different people as possible, as many different ways as possible, as many different times as possible, until they tell you no or yes or whatever, and then using that data to inform any paid campaigns that you eventually might running both branded and non-branded campaigns. I think the kind of the secret sauce there is non-branded campaigns, like stealth marketing type campaigns that allow you to be a little bit more aggressive with your outreach because they're coming from domains that are not necessarily tied to your business. You can kind of split test, A/B test what language is working, what copy is not working, that kind of stuff. So, it's been a fun adventure figuring out what all I can bring to the table, what all these systems apply to within the M&A process. And, again, I would say anybody that the ideal candidate, to reach out to me is somebody that is acquiring in volume. I really would boil it down to roll-ups. If you're just a strategic acquirer, buying a company here, company there, I'm not the ideal person for you because then the systems really become irrelevant because the systems are designed to generate volume, So if you're executing a roll-up in any space, doesn't matter the industry, doesn't matter the vertical, if it is a fragmented industry ripe for consolidation, I can help. I can help you out there.
Okay, Grant, I'm going to cut you off there for a reason. Grant, could I invite you back to do a presentation on that subject for us?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Then I think people have got enough out of today, and I would like to invite you back, please, for a full-on presentation where I will butt out and stop asking questions.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, let's do that then. Let's make that happen. Thank you,
Sounds good.
Grant Hanson, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. This podcast is A Profits, Lessons from the Trenches. Well, you've been in the trenches, you've been in the air conditioning, and you've cleaned up afterwards.
Yeah, that's right.
So you've done it all. Thank you so much for coming along today.
Thanks, Craig.